Hello Gisela, thank you for joining us today at LabourTube. Just have a few questions to ask you. The first is, given that the Prime Minister has now triggered Article 50, how can Labour make this a positive Brexit for the whole country without leaving any Remainers behind?
I think we have to start to do at first to understand why people voted to leave. And they were actually quite clear that they wanted to have the final say over their laws, their trade policy, their borders, and about their taxes. And I think that's already a unifying theme. But then Labour also has to reflect on the fact that many of the communities who we regarded as Labour heartlands, many of them voted to leave. And they did so because they felt the communities weren't resilient anymore. They felt that we hadn't responded to their needs in a proper way, and also probably hadn't even talked to them properly for a long time. Now, I know during election campaigns we all go out and we do surveys which say things like, do you support the NHS? Yes or no? But in between elections, we should have more open questions. We should have processes of genuinely engaging with the views of these communities. And what I've found when we've done it, that the voters by and large are actually by far more sensible, thoughtful and nuanced than we give them credit for. But if we go out and every time they raise a subject, like they did over immigration, and say, oh, you're just a racist, and don't even listen to their concerns, then I think we've got a problem. So I think this process of leaving the European Union, I think is a moment for national renewal. We will think differently about the United Kingdom, and we should take this opportunity as a Labour Party to also engage with our communities and say, what do you think we should be doing? And you know what? I think we'll be pleasantly surprised that they have a much clearer view of how they think we should represent them than we give them credit for.
Thank you. And how would you recommend going about that engagement and finding that engagement?
It's a long process, and it's one which requires commitment. And I give you an example of what we did in my constituency in Edgbaston. It was in the run-up to a bill which the Labour government, and doesn't it sound great, Labour government? I hope I can say this again, yeah. Brought in legislation where we were talking about immigration, but in the context of community cohesion funds, learning English language, all those kind of proposals. So we sent out 17,000 questionnaires to households and gave people a whole list of things which were included in the bill and said, how do you feel about this? When they came back, we wrote back to them again and said, well, thanks very much for coming back, but it's not cohesive at the moment. There's some contradictions in this. So this is what you thought. Different set of questions, but those questions were tailored around their answers. And we did that about 3 times. And then we asked people whether they would like to come to a session of about 100 people where we talked it through with the immigration minister. And what that does is that even those who don't agree with the outcome felt they had faith in the process. Someone genuinely listened and responded what they had to say, rather than making judgments. And I think that's something which you really have to repeat on a much bigger level. And that can't be about just finding victims. And it can't be about just representing our agenda. It has to be to really listen and hear.
And during the upcoming Brexit negotiations, do you feel confident that the 2 years, or what's more likely, the 18 months available, will be enough to secure a free trade deal? Or should we focus most of our efforts instead on agreeing transitional arrangements? Or do you think we should negotiate hard and then fall back onto WTO terms if needs be?
There are kind of 3 strands to your question. The first one is the 2 years. Well, that's the limit, however artificial it may be, is enshrined in Article 50. There's now a logic to this. It means that, as we triggered in March 2017, it means we have to come to a conclusion before the next European Union elections. So it will be the current Commission, the current European Parliament, that will also do the negotiating, as well as taking responsibility for the outcome for that. That's one thing. The second thing is, The second thing is that we tend to get confused about rules and laws. Now, the rules and laws of physics cannot be contravened. However, trade negotiating, whether it is WTO rules, what it means to have access to the single market, these are all constructions which are made in response to political will. So I think that as long as we have the political will on both sides, respect each other, and also know that our voters, both in the United Kingdom as on mainland Europe, expect us to come up with a deal which makes the economy stronger, I think we can reach a good outcome. And just finally, and I think it's really important, when people at the moment look for comparisons and say, oh, will it be like? Well, the deal we will end up with is unlike any other deal ever struck. And the reason for that is we are the world's 5th or 6th largest economy, depending on how you count it. We are the 2nd largest net contributor to the European Union. They will have to rethink how they operate, just as we will have different relationships. So I'm confident, provided we've got sufficient goodwill and political responsibility to make this work, then we can.
Thank you. There was some concern amongst Labour voters when you voted against the amendment for EU nationals' rights to remain. Given all you said during the referendum campaign about guaranteeing their rights, what would you say to those people?
I fully understand why, to the outsider, this looked sort of slightly curious. But this had something to do with the political machinations in this place. We still have seen a process by a whole group of people who currently say, well, I accept the referendum outcome, but then try and undermine it in different ways. So when you think about it, that you had a bill of 136 words, fewer than 140 words, and the booklet of amendments, I think, went to 96 pages. It was quite clear that there was a move afoot of either delaying Article 50 or having it going backwards and forwards between the Lords all the time. So in my mind, to get Article 50 unamended through the Commons and the Lords, because it does no more than give the Prime Minister authority to trigger Article 50. So therefore, anything else wasn't even going to the substance of the bill. But I'd make another point. It's quite clear to me that the kind of rights which we have to give to European Union citizens have to be tailor-made. It'll require a very special leave to remain, and for that we need primary legislation. So as far as I'm concerned, I've consistently said, and will go on saying so to the Prime Minister, your first priority now has to be the rights of EU citizens in the United Kingdom and the rights of UK citizens in the EU. And I'm very glad that Michel Barnier, the chief negotiator, said that that should be his priority too.
Thank you. Given your involvement with Change Britain, what kind of change would you like to see happen in the UK over the next 10 years?
The key thing for me is that our communities have to become more resilient. The world is changing at an ever faster pace. It sounds trite, but it happens to be the case. When I was 18 years old, I remember thinking revolutionary when someone said, well, maybe you will have more than one job and one career in your lifetime. I've had 4 distinct careers now. I think for my children it will be even different. The way they're employed, the way goods flow around the globe, all those kind of things are just changing all the time. So we cannot protect communities. But what we can do is make sure that they can adapt as the world changes around that. And for that, the key then is skills, training. And that means not just for young people, which as a Birmingham MP is very important to me. We are the fastest growing youngest city in Europe. But also for people in their 40s, people in their 50s, and maybe in their 60s if they have to work longer. So upskilling, increasing productivity is the key. So if you said to me, what do you want communities to be in 10 years' time? I want them to be by far more resilient than they are at the moment. And what the last few years have allowed us is that successive governments responded to skills shortages by immigration, skilled immigration, sometimes from countries who needed their doctors and nurses more than we did, and we cut training places here. So it's that rebalancing, that national renewal as to what's important, which is what I'm looking for.
Given your prominent position during the EU referendum campaign and the tough mayoral questions in the West Midlands, are you concerned that your seat may be in jeopardy at the next general election?
I came in 1997, and it was one of the seats which came in with the waves of the Blair victory. And, you know, if I'd gone out with the wave, I would have probably lost in 2005, but definitely lost in 2010. The fact that we held on in 2010 and held on in 2015 again makes me confident that all the good work we've done has deep foundations. But also, if the boundary review goes through, the Edgbaston constituency will change and will, on paper, be a nominally stronger Labour seat.
Do you think the UK should embrace the lower valued pound and try to rebalance our economy with a more manufacturing-led approach to investment? And do you think the government should adopt policies to keep the pound low and perhaps even push it lower?
Well, there may be kind of slight misunderstanding as to what an exchange rate is. An exchange rate reflects the strength of your economy and also your trade balance. And Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England, actually said before Brexit that he thought the pound was overvalued, that it wasn't reflecting, the exchange rate wasn't truly reflecting where the pound should be. On the other hand, you have a country like Germany that benefits from an exchange rate of the euro, which is much lower than what the Deutschmark would be much higher, and the exports would be much more expensive. So the key thing is the exchange rate reflects your economy. And for us, the challenge is how to improve productivity. And that comes back to the skill space, because there's a very basic and important principle. The more sophisticated your manufacturing model, the newer the technology you work with, the closer to that technology has to be the base where you produce it. The minute you are into mass production, which is technically very straightforward, that's when it migrates across the globe. So if we are serious about keeping manufacturing in this country, we do that by really good research, whether it is with battery-driven cars, whether it is with electric engines, you name it. Key thing is research, new products, that keeps the manufacturing base at home.
Thank you. Finally, given the recent terror attacks on our parliament and the subsequent arrests and raids coming not far from where you are, what do you think we need to do more of in order to reduce the homegrown terror threat?
You know, there's no such thing as complete safety. And when you have to strike a balance between an open democracy and keeping people safe, I think you always have to be very careful and not, our response to all these things have to be proportionate. And I was actually quite proud of politicians at Westminster in the wake of the attack, that they didn't jump to conclusions. There wasn't a knee-jerk reaction. They said the terrorists then did not succeed. I think all of us were really shaken by the fact that some people gave their lives. And the injured, who will go on living for years with the marks of these days. So we need to look at how we can keep it safer, but not overreact. As to terrorism, I'm slightly worried about the language we use on some of these occasions. What happened last Wednesday, to me, was the act of a criminal. That wasn't in pursuit of any, from what we can see so far, of any particular faith. As a Birmingham MP, I can tell you this is not the Muslim faith. He did not speak for them. And we should say that a bit more clearly. There's no excuse. Criminal acts we label as criminal. And don't try and give anybody an excuse of dragging any faith or belief into that.
In that case, would you look at all perhaps all lone wolf attacks as, again, criminal?
Yeah, I do. And it's quite interesting that of the attacks which we had in the last few years, about 25% of them came from extreme right-wing groups. So let's look at this properly, see where the sources are, see how we can actually prevent some of these things. And I think when communities feel left behind, it almost comes out of anger. And again, we need to listen to that. We need to work much more closely at a community level with our young people. But when an act of criminality occurs, then the starting point is it's a criminal act.
Is there anything you think that the Labour Party should be talking about more?
It comes back to a slogan that was on our lips when I first became an MP in '97, and we said education, education, education. And I haven't changed my mind on that. It is equipping that next generation, whether it is in early years, whether it's in primary schools, whether it is with proper apprenticeships, technical education, all those things is what will equip us for the future. That will also make our communities across the country more resilient and more adaptable. And if we get those early years right, I think everything else will flow from that. And if we don't get it right, then trying to put it right later on quite often won't work. Certainly will be far more expensive, and damage will have been done. So my passion is skills for all the children, wherever they are.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.